Hi, my name is Jenna Grady. I am a student at the University of Massachusetts studying social thought and political economy. The purpose of this interview is to collect the stories of women leaders in the labor movement and to compile them into an oral history project, including interview videos and written analysis. Many of these questions are intentionally broad. Please answer them to the best of your ability. You should feel free to interrupt and/or ask clarifying questions about the interview questions. If you don't want to answer a question or part of a question due to the confidential, private, or triggering nature of that question for you, you can abstain from answering that or any question. Do I have your permission to record and share this interview?
Yes.
Are you comfortable with me taking notes during the interview?
Yes.
Great. Where and when were you born?
I was born in Portland, Maine, and grew up in Standish. And I was born in 1978.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Maine, in Standish, Maine, which is rural Cumberland County.
What type of political ideology were you raised with, either in general or with specific regard to labor?
I don't know that there was a specific ideology. Yeah, we were kind of a family of like education was important, hard work was important. There wasn't really a lot of discussion of politics. Even, I would say, electoral politics was not particularly heavily discussed.
In what capacity are you currently involved in the labor movement?
I currently work as an organizer for the laborers local 483, which is part of LIUNA International.
Can you elaborate a little bit on what you do in that job?
I've worn a few hats in that job. So originally I was hired to assist workers in trying to rapidly change a contract campaign that was not going well to a strike escalation campaign. And we came very close to a strike. Then I worked with the local on an additional contract campaign for the zoo workers, Metro Zoo and Parks. I've also been working to overhaul their steward program and reinstitute a series of trainings that sort of empower stewards to do their work on the shop floor more effectively, and have also been doing for the last year most of their communications work, Facebook, website, newsletter, and email updates. Oh, and I'm working with a new group of workers to help organize. It's a small local.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that, if it's not confidential at this point?
The new organizing drive?
Yeah.
It's not public.
Okay. Totally fair.
I can talk about new organizing, but I can't talk about that one.
I have been there. How did your background, upbringing, and experiences influence your decision to become involved in the labor movement?
The labor movement. So all of my father's side of the family, for the most part, came out of the mills, the paper mills in Maine. My dad was the first to go to college, and he taught construction trade skills, basically, out of college, and for about 25 years as a teacher. And then my other uncles worked in Bath Iron Works, which is also a union shop. So we didn't really necessarily talk a lot about unions, but it was sort of those were the good jobs, and teachers were also good jobs. My dad passed away when I was 13, and it was really important that he had a teacher's pension that included survivor benefits for us to be able to have health care and keep our house and all those things that you don't think much about until you really, really need them. So I didn't actually end up getting involved politically, I guess, through the labor movement per se. I actually was very skeptical of the labor movement. When I went to college, I had already been active for a few years doing work on gay rights in Maine. It was when there was a big attack on gay rights from a group called Concerned Maine Families back in the 90s. They were trying to make sure no one had rights. And so we were doing like door-to-door canvassing when I was in high school. I would hitch a ride to Portland and get out on the doors to canvass for gay rights. And when I went to college and folks suggested that I might think about sort of the intersection of my being sort of a scholarship working class kid and my politics together, that maybe I should try out the labor movement, to which I said, aren't they corrupt and defunct, and I don't see the point. And they introduced me to folks in the UE, the United Radio Electrical Machine Workers of America. Say that a lot on the doors. It's not easy. And so I started getting involved with them, working as an intern, running the Workers' Rights Center. When it was first getting off the ground, I was sort of the first staffer of the Workers' Rights Center in Vermont, working with the UE. And it's awesome now. I can't take any credit for that because I was a bumbling fool trying to figure out how to promote it and design a resource guide for it and recruit people. But that was sort of how I got introduced, and through the UE, which I had a lot of respect for, both their politics and their style of organizing. So I ended up taking a job with them when I left college and moving to Los Angeles to organize with them. So that's how I ended up in actual paid union work.
You just pretty much described this, but if there's anything else you want to say, how and why did you join the labor movement?
Well, I would say that the one other thing I hadn't said was that I had tried thinking about how I would translate my politics into other formats. I had done work with political lobby groups and advocacy groups. I spent 6 months in Ireland and Northern Ireland studying peace and conflict resolution and interviewing women in working class neighborhoods. I had really tried thinking about the different ways that one gets involved, and I was certain that I did not want to do party politics or legislative politics. It felt really disempowering when I was working with low-income women advocating for childcare. And I was pretty certain that I had already done a bunch of work building direct action work on campus, and that I wanted a place that seemed like they had a good plan for how to organize and build power, and that incorporated the ability to build direct action into how we took on particularly working class issues. I felt pretty strongly about figuring out how to translate this really privilege that I had had of being able to go to college into how to fight class battles.
What do you consider to be the most important campaign you've been involved in within the labor movement? And important is up to your interpretation.
What's important? Yowzer. So I think in the 16 years that I've been in the labor movement, there's kind of one of the most important things has been working directly with rank and file folks to flip the dynamics of power, but also do that in a way that they're actually sustainably learning the skills of how to organize and how to fight, so that whether I'm there or not, they have the capacity to continue to do battle. And so one of the campaigns, I think there was, at least I know that there was some proof of that lasting impact, was I worked with workers at Stanford University and Hospital. We ended up doing a strike and built to almost a second strike. And the local after that did not do much to continue to build the workforce. But I got a phone call years later from some of the member leaders that we had worked with who had largely run the strike, saying that they had successfully fought another round of contract campaign basically on their own. And so I feel like that was a piece of, okay, hold on one second. Hey, ladies, remember how we talked about how this was going to be a moment where I was going to need to have some space and quiet? So you're going to need to find an activity that works outside of this little circle of the table, okay? Okay? You want to see? Okay, but you'll have to be sure that this is not one that you'll be able to touch the buttons, okay? You'll just be able to see what's happening. Okay.
This is your mama.
Yeah. No, this is not my mama. This is someone who lives in New York, though. She's asking me questions about the job that I do. Yeah, you go to meetings sometimes. So campaign-wise, I think, and overall, I think that's one of the things that I hope is achieved through the work I do. And then one of the campaigns I think that I was most proud of is I did a 3-year campaign where basically we designed what does it look like to have unions do community and union campaigning. It was something called We Are Oregon, and we got a significant budget from SEIU to run really a campaign any way we wanted to, which was kind of astounding, given that they would hire me, knowing that I have sort of anarchist syndicalist background, to run a do whatever you want organizing drive in your community. And so we built a organizing campaign around direct community control of food, work, and shelter, and went out into the community working with folks in neighborhood groups and built networks of activists to support neighborhood groups, to use direct action, to directly resist evictions, to demand lost wages of workers who had had wage theft, to support union fights. We did work with port shutdown in Longview. We worked with them. And we also started a community group in one of the poorest sections of Portland around control and access to food, where folks started their own basically food buy cooperative, and also a youth group that they are continuing to run. So we had 3 years to try to develop models of how would a union interact with the community in a way that would actually build real organizing, and that was what we came up with. We ended up building a really substantially big network of about 800 folks willing to do direct action to back up particularly the housing work. At one point we were resisting at 13 houses in Portland, resisting eviction of folks who were facing foreclosure evictions. We did a number of move-ins of people who had left their home, and then we moved them back in. And we built a support base of about 5,000 people who were not necessarily willing to put their bodies on the line, but who were consistently supportive. And we built quite a bit of neighborhood support network. The theory was that neighborhoods would in fact support very militant action, maybe not directly doing that militant action themselves, but if we did the groundwork of organizing, having conversations with folks and having them invited to the houses, know the families, and understand why the fight was happening, that they would actually support very escalated militant action against evictions. And it turned out that that was actually pretty true. We had a lot of support from neighborhoods for people coming out who didn't necessarily look a lot like themselves. Like, we had a lot of anarchist punk kids who were willing to put their bodies on the lines in front of, little old black grandma's houses. And we also had neighbors who were there saying, we support you, and would put lawn signs out all over the neighborhood saying that they supported the resistance. So that was probably the campaign that I feel like I got a chance to design what I wish the labor movement was doing, and try to see what would happen and work with a team. We had a team of about 20 folks that were amazing and brought lots of amazing skills to the table that aren't traditionally recruited into the labor movement, like folks who were hip-hop artists and street artists and had a background of militant street fight and all kinds of stuff that doesn't usually get asked for on resumes in the labor movement, but who I thought brought a skill set that would change our ability to have real power. So that was probably the campaign that I feel proudest of having created some space for and been able to run for 3 years.
Oh. How do you feel that your identity as a woman has impacted your motivations and experiences in the labor movement?
Oh my. I think there's a strange double-edged sword for being a woman in the labor movement. As someone who does a lot of base work organizing, I think it's so much easier to be a girl and go to someone's door and say, "Hi, you've never met me, and I'm from this union thing. Well, can I come in?" I feel like there is an advantage to that. And I know there is. I use it all the time. On the other hand, I think there's a real culture within the labor movement that is, and it varies union to union, but in general, I'd say the culture remains the same. Even in largely female-represented workforces, the culture of what it means to be a union organizer, what it means to work in a union, is very male-focused. And if you're a woman, you have to be tougher, smarter, less breakable, more strategic, and gutsier, but not make mistakes. If you want to be taken seriously, especially if you're starting as a young woman. I was always mistaken for being even younger than I was when I started in the labor movement around at 20. And there was just a lot of assumptions about what I would be able to do and who I'd be able to talk to based on that. And I don't know many male organizers who routinely talk about having to be hit on while they're at work. Some do, but it's an interesting thing that, as a female organizer, my getting to know people sometimes gets interpreted as clearly I am wanting a different kind of relationship with them. But I think even from the folks from a structural sense, the labor movement is really still structured in a way that it's really hard to be an organizer and say get pregnant or be a mom or any of the things that are, sure, you could be a dad, but the expectation wouldn't necessarily be that you take as much time off, and you wouldn't have to. Oh, hold on. Hey, Ruby, honey, what is it that you're trying to ask about? You were looking for your cup? Are you thirsty?
No.
No? You just wanted to know where it went? It went in the sink for sure. Yeah, I can get it for you. Do you want me to put water in it when I get it for you? Okay, I'll be right back. This is the one you were using, so this is the one I'll get for you because it's free.
Okay. I take over there.
You can take it over there with you.
No.
Okay. Well, this is the one that has water in it and is there for you. You can choose not to use it if you would like to. Okay, but that's the one that you have? Okay, I understand. And in a little while I can help you with a different one, but that one is available right this minute with the water in it for you. And you're welcome to take it over. Okay. Then you can choose to do something else. But that cup is available for you right now. I understand. If you would like to get a different cup, you can do that. Okay, if you want to get a different cup yourself, you can do that. But I'm not going to be able to offer that option myself. Oh, that one is not clean right now. I understand why you want the pink cup, but it's not clean right now to be used. You'll have to wait a while for that. Maybe by lunchtime. It's actually not in there. But you can look in there if you'd like to see if that's true or not. Okay. Sorry.
Remarkable
Pink cup is highly popular.
Yes.
As I was saying, it's really hard to be a union organizer and a mom. I have a solution. Do you want to dump the water that's there into that cup so you could use that cup and have the water? Aha, there we go. Cups. So yeah, I think culturally the labor movement is an interesting place. I think it's very, even in majority female unions, that there's a lot of male leadership, but there's also a lot of sort of, I don't know, it's sort of like a shock troop or cowboy culture to being initiated as an organizer, that you, how long can you stay on the road? How disconnected can you be from your social circles that you already had? Will you move constantly? Will you work 100 hours for as long as your body can stand it? Like, there's this kind of like culture of hazing. I don't know. It's not really hazing. No one's like taking you out back and slapping you, but it is like this trying a very extreme sense of testing, instead of saying, hey, how do we create a way that more people might make it through the process of learning to be an organizer, which is basically a skilled trade. I mean, it takes practice and mentorship and assistance and training, but you can't learn it from a book. You've got to practice on campaigns, and you have to practice on campaigns where people with more skill are taking on some of the hard stuff, so you can see how to do it before you have to do it yourself. Like, I mean, it's not all that different than any other skilled trade. But I think how culturally the movement is developed is that either you're supposed to jump in and just know how to do all of that stuff, or you're just, you know, the people who burn out are just no good anyway, is kind of the like culture that's created. And so like, I'm unusual. Almost everyone I started organizing with isn't an organizer anymore. And it's not because they weren't good enough or they weren't skilled, but because there's just a grind of like burning through people. Even once you get to be a good organizer, there's this constant desire to like grind. Or to carve out, you know, the alternative is you work for a really crappy organization that carves out a cushy job that you feel like you're a slug, you know, you're just going in and being a bureaucrat. So if you have ideals, you're going to get burned through, because those are the folks that get used up. So I think, but I think that culture is very like, there's a lot of macho to that culture. It's a lot of like, who can prove themselves. And like, I've been told point blank as an organizer on organizing campaigns, well, you know, the women who work there, they prefer a man to lead them. I don't think you're going to be successful working with these women because they need a strong man to help them through this campaign. Or, you know, the assumption that however experienced or inexperienced the man is in the room, he's probably the person in charge of the campaign, not me. Is sort of a culture that I've seen happen a lot. Or, you know, running a meeting and one of the male organizers in the room challenges me and what I'm presenting to them and my ability to tell them that they have to do this plan more in a way that they would never challenge my equivalent male counterpart when he's doing the same thing. And, you know, as a woman, you just get used to it, right? I'm used to being challenged all the time, so I just assume no one is going to take for granted that I am good at what I do. I'm going to have to just prove myself. And that's true whether I was in the labor movement for 2 years or 16 years. Like, if I walk into a room, I assume at this point I still have to prove myself as if I have never done anything. And that, I think, is kind of not a fair culture, but I think that is where it's at. And I've, you know, developed a skill set of how I go about doing that and how I go about dealing with, you know, whatever the assumptions are that I can't work with all men. Right now, most of the folks I work with are blue-collar men in trades-based jobs, sort of like characteristically not female organizer job. And part of the reason they hired me, though, is because I actually know how to take people out on strike, and none of them did. And some of them thought that I was not long for their union until they got a sense that, in fact, I knew my shit. And that I did know how to take people out on strike, and I knew what it was like to run a picket line. And I had actually spent more time on picket lines than most of them combined. But there was never a space of assumption, well, she has 16 years experience and that's all written down, and, you know, clearly she's the dude. You know, like, I had to prove I was the dude. It's helpful, and I've talked to women in other, like, trades jobs, and I think it's a true framing. It's actually really helpful a lot of times that people don't recognize that you're a woman, they just recognize that you're an organizer. And so if you can neutralize the sense of your gender being important, people are more likely to work with you, particularly like male bargaining units.
How do you feel that that other aspects of your identity have impacted your motivations and experiences in the labor movement?
I think coming from a rural place, I have a certain perspective of an approach to people that is sometimes different than folks who come from a more urban setting. I grew up in a place where how you solved problems was largely to call together people that you knew who had different skills and who were in your community, because there wasn't there wasn't an infrastructure to go out and hire this and do that. And so, you know, how things got built and how plumbing got done and all kinds of things had to do with creating networks of people like yourself who had different kinds of skills and who could work together and help each other out. So I think that background informs my deep understanding of that this works, that it is actually possible to organize and solve problems in a really basic way. But I feel like that was the culture I grew up with. That's what you do to when you face a challenge is you call the people around you who are in your your trusted circles, and they help you solve it. I think even though we weren't very political as a family, I think there were some really key things that happened when I was growing up. My uncle used to work, he was a skilled shoemaker for LL Bean, which is, the shoe company in Maine with the boots that everyone knows. So he was a skilled shoemaker. There used to be many of them. And in the, I think it was late 80s, they laid every one of them off and shipped making the boots to Saipan. But kept the Made in Maine label because they, or Made in the USA label, and decided to ditch the Made in Maine label for their shoes. And it was sort of, I don't know, it was such a huge impact. He was the uncle that was at our house all the time, and seeing him go from being a skilled shoemaker, which he was really proud of, to having to figure out a job here and a job there. Many years later, ironically, he ended up working for LL Bean again. He currently does. He's a janitor and works the night shift for minimum pay. He also spent a period of time working in a shoe sweatshop. Yes, they exist in the United States. And had respiratory problems because of the lack of ventilation, ended up hospitalized. So I think seeing people in my family, but also people in Maine struggle, growing up, like there was no rich, everyone was poor. That was the the joke is we don't have to worry about the next depression. We never got over the Great Depression, so we're just fine. So I think all of that kind of informed how I felt about class and about the workers that I was working with. I feel like I see a lot of times people who enter the labor movement assume that workers who don't go to college or don't have a high education are not very smart people with a lot of skills. And I feel like growing up in a rural place where there was a really high value on a wide breadth of skills, I don't approach workers that way. I think of workers as equals who bring a lot, and maybe my skill set is different than theirs. But I might be really good at, going into a boss's office and feeling confident. But they also bring a lot of skills and experience to the table. And so organizing from that place rather than from a place where clearly I must be the professional who knows the plan, which usually the plan is to all get together and come up with a plan. So.
You've touched on this also, but do you have critiques of the labor movement?
Do I have critiques? Oh dear. Let's see. Yes. Let's see how to put this. I think that the labor movement, so I guess I'll say it this way. I feel infinitely tired of the conversation about how awful it is that the labor movement is dying. I feel like there's a version of the labor movement that's dying, and sometimes I wish it were dead already. and maybe that sounds too harsh, but I think that half the time we're in our own way, that the way we go about doing things has become this weird ritual of not even being successful when we do them that way, but it feels safe to do it that way because that's the way that it's supposed to work, because it has for, I don't know, maybe for a decade or two it actually was effective. Someone will always say it worked for a while. I'm not sure entirely. So I think, and I guess, I mean, my We Are Oregon work kind of hints at this. I think that there is an entirely different approach needed for how we think about organizing. I don't think that there is a death of organizing. I don't think people are less oppressed in some way economically or at work. And I don't think that there is a lack of desire. I think that the desire is actually out there to fight, but that the tools that the labor movement offers people and the end results that they're offering people are unattractive and unsuccessful, and that workers are not stupid and they see unattractive and unsuccessful and rightly say, hey, I don't think you're actually offering a good plan. But I think there's so much potential to actually do things differently. I think thinking about it as a movement that is class-based instead of this very procedural structure of trying to get people through the many hurdles of board process to be recognized as an official union. I think pushing the boundaries on tactics over and over until we take back some of the tactics that were taken off the table for the labor movement. And I think a lot of those things are outside maybe the box of trying to get officially recognized in a traditional labor union. You can do lots of things as a community group. Even workers not being officially recognized. I mean, that's part of what the Walmart campaign is about, right? They've carved out some of that. But you know, for I think a long time, anything more militant than a picket line was somehow not on the menu anymore. And I think that's crazy. We're outspent and we're dealing with a real disadvantage of power. Our power is strength in numbers, so strikes, sabotage, shutdowns, blockades, like these are all tools, sit downs, like that we've been told are off the menu. They're off the menu because they work and there are tools for us. They're not muted, they're not easily controlled. So I think part of my critique of the labor movement is that I feel like it gave up on using some of its most successful tools in order for a supposed exchange of this, like, but we'll have some good contracts. And I think that even if that was a period of time that did exist, I think it was limited and not very inclusive of many workers who really benefited from putting our full toolkit aside and saying, well, we can get a few good contracts. I think ultimately the cost has been enormous to everyone, not just organized workers, but unorganized workers.
How has your involvement with the labor movement influenced you in terms of personal beliefs, political ideology, social connections, or other elements of your life?
Let's see. Yowzer. I think my involvement with the labor movement, I certainly am not a starry-eyed idealist in the sense that I don't, I'm not sure if I ever was a starry-eyed idealist, but I think it's reinforced a couple of things around a belief that we actually are capable of organizing and changing things in a fundamental way about our working conditions and our lives. beyond work as well, and that there is, particularly when workers take actions like strikes and other, I think, really strong action together, there's a long-standing impact that has both inside people's work, but also inside themselves, their ability to say no to when something is wrong, and to stand up for that in a number of places. And so I think that seeing that happen over and over in the labor movement has transitioned my being like, I think that's kind of true feelings to to feelings that are, no, this really is where potential is at, that it's made me feel more deeply true that there is an enormous potential to see things change. But I think working the labor movement has also made me, maybe it's jaded, but incredibly convinced that electoral politics are useless. And I guess that's maybe too strongly worded, but there maybe is a role. I don't know. I feel like so many people argue for the role of it that it's almost helpful just to say useless to drive home the point of how little use I feel like there is. And again, I feel like workers know that and don't participate, and then we judge them for somehow being stupid, when really it's that they see the score and they're like, that score is crap. We don't win this ever. Like, this is worse than the casinos. Why are we keeping this game up? Why do we keep backing this game? We keep losing. We keep getting our ass kicked. So I think politically, I never was that big into electoral politics, but just the real world feeling behind that is true in a stronger way, having seen it play out over and over again, where unions dump tremendous resources into supposedly this great candidate or this great thing, and it's crap. Nothing comes out of it, and nothing changes, and they turn out to just sell us out or do nothing or whatever. So yeah, I think politically I am even less invested in electoral politics as a meaningful way for working class people to have any say in their world. Which the entire labor movement would cringe and argue about, I would hazard to guess. As they gear up to spend millions on a presidential election.
So the next two questions are the last two questions, but also are two-parters. So based on whether or not, or whether you say yes or no.
Okay.
So do you see the labor movement as connected to larger issues of justice and progress?
I think it should be. I think it's a piece. This was sort of part of the idea behind the community work that we were doing through Rare Oregon, was trying to resituate unions within the community rather than as if the union and the community are two separate organizations, which is how unions often interact with the community. Hold on one second. There's a fracas going on. Come on, see. Okay. So I think, let's see. What was the question again? Sorry.
So do you see the labor movement as connected to larger issues of justice and progress? If yes, what other movements do you see it connected to? And in what ways do you see these movements connected? And in what ways do you see them in tension or conflict? And if not, why not?
I think the labor movement actually is both completely disconnected and connected in like small ways. I feel like it varies a lot. To talk about the labor movement as a movement is interesting. It's not a very organized movement in an odd way. There's so much difference amongst labor organizations within it, and so little agreement about I would say a social platform for the labor movement as a movement. But I think the intersections that seem to be both emerging more and very important are around some of the issues of environment. I think the intersection of coal and oil, transport with workers like docks and railway, and the communities along those lines is an interesting intersection where all of these pieces are potentially working together. Though that has not always been the relationship with the labor movement and the environment. I think the same is true with things like immigration and struggle around justice for people of color in the U.S., where there should be a clear alignment, but that hasn't been the history, nor is it even the current culture in kind of uniformly throughout the labor movement, that it doesn't just unquestioningly align itself with workers of color. And I think that's one of the weaknesses of the labor movement, is that it gets really distracted from having a good social movement sense of what it stands for. In fact, I would say some unions would tell you that they aren't about social movement. And I think that's the deadish part that maybe should just die. Because I think ultimately, if there is a labor movement, it has to be situated, I think, in a broader sense of social struggle. And if it's not situating itself there, then it's becoming increasingly irrelevant to everybody affected by those other broader senses of social struggle, which is pretty much everybody. So I think there are those connections. I think you can't say for a whole movement, though, that those connections are of the labor movement. They're of pieces of the labor movement. There are people within it. There are some organizations within it, but they aren't of the whole movement. I don't think you could say that the whole movement is there. Hi, I know it's gone for a little while, but I have only one more question I have to do, and then we can talk about all the things we need to do. She didn't leave the TV off? I know, it's okay though, because I told her it was okay to turn it on. If you wanted to watch too, that would be okay. I don't think she wants to ride the bike. I'm going to answer one more question, and then I'll help you communicate with Amanda what it is that you're concerned about, okay? Okay. Okay, you're going to go on the bike to do that.
All right, this last one. Do you plan on staying involved in the labor movement?
Good question. Yes, sort of, I think.
So, if yes, why and in what capacities? And if no, why not and what do you plan to pursue instead?
So I'm sort of at a point in working in the labor movement where I'm trying to decide how much I want to do this for how long. And I think particularly how much longer I can do campaigning work. So where I would like to see my energy go is doing a lot more work helping develop skills and training and support for workers learning how to organize and how to use their skills and how to plan strategic campaigns, and a lot less direct one organizing drive after another work. It's a long 16 years. And so I think that's where I would see my energy going more. And I think if there's not a path to taking some level of step out of sort of one intense campaign after another, I think I would seriously consider just leaving work in the labor movement.
That wraps up my formal questions. Do you have any additional questions for me or anything else you'd like to tell me or share?
No, I think you diaper and negotiate around bike riding, but hopefully this was helpful to your paper.
Yes, it was so helpful. Yeah, so I'm going to conclude. Thank you for talking with me. I'm going to take us off record and then get started. Hi, my name is Jenna Grady. I'm a student at the University of Massachusetts studying social thought and political economy. The purpose of this interview is to collect, or this series of interviews is to collect stories of women leaders in the labor movement and to compile them into an oral history project, including interview videos and written analysis. Many of these questions are intentionally broad. Please answer them to the best of your capabilities. You should feel free to interrupt and or ask clarifying questions about the interview questions. If you do not want to answer a question or part of a question due to the confidential, private, and or triggering nature of that question for you, you can abstain from answering that or any question. Do I have your permission to record this interview?
Sorry, can you say that one more time?
Do I have your permission to record this video?
Oh, yes, and put it online.
Awesome, perfect. Okay. Are you comfortable with me taking notes
Yes.
during the interview? Wonderful. Okay.
Are you comfortable with me taking notes?
Okay. Where or when were you born and where?
I was born June 15th, 1992 in Milford, Massachusetts.
Where did you grow up?
Whitensville, Massachusetts.
What type of political ideology were you raised with, either in general or with specific regard to labor and the labor movement?
In general, so my father was very heavily Democrat as I was growing up, and my mother was like moderate Republican. However, they both didn't really talk about politics all that much. I think they wanted my sisters and I to decide for ourselves. And then also because they came from different political backgrounds, they didn't really want to talk about it in the house. They would bring up a lot of arguments. Over the years, my mom has become far more Democrat. And that, I guess, almost parallels my journey towards pretty much socialism. But I think that around labor, there was a good amount of conversation, at least between me and my dad. His dad was a part of a union, and so as a result, that history, though not talked about a lot as I was when I was a kid, when I started being more involved with the labor movement and talking about unions and that kind of stuff, that history kind of came up and we started to talk about it a little bit more.
Cool. In what capacity are you currently involved in the labor movement?
So currently I am an AmeriCorps Vista, which means as a part of my job, I'm not allowed to talk about it at all. Personally, however, I consider it a very real part of my life and something I'll pick back up following this year of service.
Can you speak a little more to what it means to not be able to talk about labor, or what the restrictions on you are and why, as a participant in AmeriCorps?
Yeah, sure. So personally, I'm allowed to be pro-union. Professionally, I am not allowed to engage in conversations either pro or anti-union. For me, this is really frustrating, especially considering the economic situation of the town that I'm in. So yeah, I think, I'm not sure, they never really talk about the history of why you're not allowed to be pro or anti-union. I'm guessing that it has to do with the fact that it's a federally funded program. So that probably is the main thing.
How did your background, upbringing, and experiences influence your decision to become involved in the labor movement?
Hold on a second. Okay. So I guess the biggest thing is that I have worked ever since it was legally allowed for a minor to work in Massachusetts. So at the time it was, I think, 14. Before that I babysat and that kind of stuff. So for me, a lot of those jobs were really awesome, and I did some really great things. But I also worked several jobs where the treatment of me and my coworkers was pretty horrible. And so working long hours without breaks or that kind of thing tends to kind of make you angry. And for me, because I had access to college and I was able to go to the University of Massachusetts, I was able to talk about with other people who have studied these kinds of things and start to connect what was going on in my life to a much broader issue. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. How and why did you join the labor movement?
Okay. How? So when I first joined, when I first started at UMass Amherst, I was involved in a service learning program called Impact. And through that program, I served in Amherst at Duffy, Massachusetts. And I continued that service throughout my time at UMass. But after my first year in Impact, I joined the Citizen Scholars Program, which focuses on a vision for an ideal society, and then throughout the course of 2 years, shifts into how to organize for change. And so when I joined that program, conversations started happening around what was going on in politics. As a high school student, I was not super into politics because most of my friends did not agree with me. So I was a lot more radical even in high school. I just didn't know how to express it. And so when I started hanging out with people that agreed with me and I could actually talk about the realities of living in America and the blatant, horrifying, terrible treatment of workers throughout the United States, it kind of started to shift my thinking. And so I was watching the Republican primary back in 2012, and I got really mad. The next day in class with CSP, someone mentioned that there was a protest, and they were looking for students to go. They had a bus, and the protest was happening in Boston. And so I took that ride into Boston, and I literally had no idea what the protest was about. I just knew that I was angry and that it was about something to do with banks and their mistreatment. I think actually it was in 2000. It must have been 2011. Yeah, it was the fall of 2011 because that's when the Occupy movement sort of kicked off. And so as I was at this protest, protesting Bank of America, Occupy had just started in New York, and the Boston chapter was starting up that evening. And so I thought I was going to be arrested at that event, even though I didn't. I was just standing there, like, holding a sign. But that event kind of sparked my idea of what power was and how power could be shifted. I mean, it was also a huge time of talking about economic inequality in the United States. That's kind of one of the beautiful things about the Occupy movement, is that it made that mantra of the 99% versus the 1% a pretty common reality when talking among college-age students, and then beyond that as well, I think. And so for me, that event was kind of the kickoff, and 6 months later I was arrested outside of Sallie Mae, doing some other protesting, largely around student rights and the right to an education.
Could you talk a little bit about your involvement in the Student Labor Action Project?
Sure. So I started with the Student Labor Action Project after Occupy Amherst kicked off. And so, yeah, and the first campaign that I ever worked on was the Responsible Employer Policy, which later turned into the Coalition for Responsible UMass Employment, which eventually won Project Labor Agreement. It was a 2 to 3 year campaign. I joined it in its second year. And so for me, that campaign just kind of launched an interest in how big institutions hurt people, largely through their unfair employment practices. Yeah, so I started then, and following that, and then also another big campaign that we worked on was the Peer Mentor campaign. They cut 75 student jobs that first semester that I was involved with SLAP, and so SLAP ran a campaign to restore those jobs. Yeah, and then the following year, I guess we also worked on tuition at UMass and access to university, and so but that was part of SLAP National as a whole, and
I just so
that's where I ended up getting arrested. And then after that, I became here in SLAP, and worked on other things. That was very incoherent. I'm sorry.
No, it's totally fine. What do you consider to be the most important campaign you've been involved in within the labor movement? And important is up to your interpretation.
Maya? Mm-hmm. I know you haven't had a chance to really all make a decision about this. Is it anything close?
So for me personally, the most important campaign that I worked on with SLAP was around
I would say
the contract for the RA union. I think for me it was the most important because it allowed me to be able to finish college, because without that job, I don't think I would have been able to afford it. And so I think that's why for me it was the most important. One is because we changed the way that RAs are treated in many ways. And the big thing there is that RAs at UMass could be fired for pretty much anything, for a resident turning up or saying that they had music playing too loudly, this was my personal favorite. An RA was fired because they called the police when they came upon a resident who was passed out drunk, and they were at the time intoxicated. So the RA was fired because they were acting in their job as an RA, but because they called the police when the person was passed out. And so one of the things that we won with that contract was not just cause, which is what we were hoping for, but it was a step towards it. And the step that we took was that RAs could use past examples as a defense for not being fired. So like if someone else was not fired for calling someone when they were intoxicated and acting as an RA, then in the future another RA could use that. And so that like job security, I think, was one, a big relief to me, and two, I think really important for just treatment of RAs, because when RAs are fired, they not only lose their job, they also lose their housing, which could mean that they cannot continue at the university. And I think that might have been the case for me. I don't know if it didn't happen, but I think that would have been very real, very real problem.
How did you get involved with the RA bargaining campaign? And in what capacity were you involved? I know you spoke a little bit to it.
Yeah, so I served on the joint council for the UAW. So I met with all of the shops of UAW 2322. And then I also served on the bargaining committee. Yeah, so I guess I'm trying to think when I started. I think I really started getting heavily involved when the peer mentors were cut, which was in my sophomore year. And so when the peer mentors were cut, I had been an RA at that point of a first year dorm. Yeah, do you want me to fill in like the background information for this, or can you just kind of?
If you want to do a short synopsis of the background, that would be great.
Cool. So peer mentors at UMass serve in first year residence halls. My first year as an RA, I was in a first year residence hall in Southwest campus at UMass. When the peer mentors were cut, they were not able, the administration who made the decision to cut the peer mentors were not able to come up with a real good reason for why they were doing it. They just kind of gave anecdotal evidence. And then additionally, it looked like they were going to be hiring 2 administrative staff with the funding that was provided for the peer mentor program. So yeah, so some pretty messed up stuff. And as a first year RA, in a first year residence hall. So I was a sophomore responsible for 25 freshmen. Additionally, I was involved in other things. I worked another job, and I was involved in a student organization on campus. So I didn't feel like I had the time or the energy to devote 40 hours a week to the RA job. And that's kind of why the peer mentor was there. And it was to supplement the work that the RA was doing. So the peer mentors were cut, and I looked at that and I said, well, if they can just decide that those jobs aren't necessary, what is their take on the RA job? What if they decide that that is no longer necessary? And so I think for me, that's when I became involved with the RA union, because unionizing the peer mentors would have meant that this decision could not have gone forward. They would have had to jump through a few more hoops or break the law, as they're doing now.
How do you feel that your identity as a woman has impacted your motivations and your experiences in the labor movement?
Big question.
Yeah.
Can you say it one more time?
Absolutely. How do you feel, or to what extent do you feel that your identity as a woman has impacted your motivations and your experiences in the labor movement.
Okay. So I think the biggest motivating factor is largely around the treatment of healthcare workers. And so I worked in a nursing home for 4 years as a personal care assistant. A lot of my coworkers were immigrants to the United States. Additionally, I worked in a really wealthy nursing home, and so a lot of the residents came from fairly conservative backgrounds. And then throw into the mix that when people get dementia, their ability to control what they say and what they think is drastically reduced. And so for me, one of my mentor as a personal care assistant was a Black woman, and she faced racist comments and just horrifying things on a daily basis. Because a lot of the residents had dementia. They grew up a time when racism was not okay, but it happened. And so I think for me, having to be in that environment where it's like, how can these people treat you like this? How is this okay? Additionally, about 90% of personal care assistants and certified nursing assistants, so PCAs and CNAs, are women. And so the motivation behind doing this work largely came from my experience in that field, and just the one that, similarly how they would say racist comments, there were a lot of really sexist comments from the men who lived in the nursing home. Again, some of that might have to do with them losing touch with reality, or growing up in a time where sexism was viewed very differently. So I think that those hostile work environments where, while my coworkers were phenomenal, and a lot of time management was really great too, because most nurses are women as well, I think that nothing was being done about this, and that in addition to that, a lot of personal care assistants and certified nursing assistants that work in like home settings receive even less protection than we received, and we received very little protection. It was the kind of thing where like you could fill out a report about harassment, but at the same time, that person who is there has nowhere else to go. And so you build these relationships with your residents who you take care of on a daily basis. And yet, if they have a bad day, they can still say really horrifying and like terrible things to you. And so for me, a desire for more protection for my coworkers and for myself was one of the huge motivating factors. I think my experiences. I think UMass Lab has a really strong tradition of women leaders, which I think for me was really empowering. That doesn't mean that on a fairly consistent basis, either in my work with the Student Government Association or SEPA as a whole, that like I've felt 100% comfortable all the time. I think a lot of times I felt like I didn't belong or didn't have a voice that mattered. I guess even though like over and over again I would tell myself and people would tell me, no, like your opinion matters, it's important. It took a long time to be able to talk about any of this in a really coherent way. I think I yeah, I felt I didn't know enough to step up, or that my, yeah, took a while, but.
How do you feel that the other aspects of your identity have impacted your motivations and experiences in the labor movement?
So I grew up in a pretty working class environment. I grew up in a very working class community in the sense that people would take care of each other without really. Did it freeze?
I don't think so. Did you say would or wouldn't
What?
take care of each other?
Oh, would.
Okay.
Yeah. So the community relied heavily upon each other to sustain folks when times got hard. So I saw this in the rotation of neighbors and how neighbors would take care of other people's children and vice versa. My parents would take care of other neighborhood children when their parents had to do something or go to work or take those extra shifts. And then also in just providing materials for community members that were struggling. I also grew up very Catholic. My parents were both heavily involved in the Catholic Church, and so for me, I think one of the lost my train of thought. Okay, yeah. So my parents are very Catholic, and so but they always emphasize the preferential option for the poor and vulnerable, which is a part of Catholic social teaching. And so I think it was kind of ingrained from the beginning that we are in this together, and if one person is hurting, then other people are hurting. And so I think that kind of carried out into work with unions and working to protect people on the job, both from losing their jobs, because that can mean really horrifying things for the community as a whole. If one person struggles, the rest struggle. And then also, I think in other aspects as well. I think so. Both of my parents worked 2 jobs as I was growing up, and so just to make ends meet and to make sure that my sisters and I could go to Catholic school, which they thought was very important for their for our development as Catholics, and then also for our development as people. And so, so I think I grew up with this reality that one job was not enough to live to the standard of living to which my parents wanted to. And that was really hard to come to terms with, and I definitely still haven't really. But I think that seeing how hard my parents worked just to make sure that we could go to a good school that they felt was, in a good environment for us, I think was really sobering and not the kind of reality I want for my children. I want parents to be able to work one job. I want communities to be able to support each other. And I think that without families in secure economic positions, that can't happen. And so, yeah, I think those were kind of the motivations behind doing the work, and then also the way that I was raised to do the work.
Yeah. I'm just waiting for quiet. Okay.
Yeah, we
Can you
still
hear
use
me?
that. I don't know what.
Yes, now I can.
It went to my.
Awesome.
email.
How has your involvement with the labor movement influenced you in terms of political beliefs, personal beliefs, political ideology, social connections, or other elements of your life?
So sorry, personal, political.
Personal, political, social, or other.
Okay. So, my personal beliefs. What's an example of a personal belief? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so what's an example of a personal belief versus a political belief?
Up to interpretation.
Okay.
So how you view your personal life is one potential interpretation. But if you're going by the personal is political, I guess it's all one and the same.
Okay, cool. So for me, the my involvement in the labor movement has definitely changed my life. I think it has made me a lot more hopeful as a person, largely because I see the way that communities can come together and change the world. Maybe not a big part of the world, but can change things to make them better. And I think that hopefulness is kind of the thing that sustains me when I see horrifying things happen in the world. So, for example, Rick Perry's recent decision to try and sue Obama for his executive action on immigration. That makes me really mad. But I also realize that, that even though the political process is slow, it doesn't mean that communities aren't changing the way we view each other and we view the world. I think it has also made me realize the unbelievable corruption that is reality in the entire world. And I think, sorry, this is kind of broad.
No, it's great.
I think that it has also just it definitely changed my political beliefs, in the sense that, like, I've always been pretty, I guess, liberal, but I think that it definitely radicalized me in the sense that if there is something wrong, I think that people can change it, and I think that the way that they change it is by coming together. I think it has enabled me to see the power that people can have when they work together. And so as a result, in my personal life, it means I struggle really hard whenever I can't work with someone. It can get in the way, but I think also it makes me strive to be a better person and work with people even across difference, and especially across difference, to figure out ways where we can help each other. Politically, started off, I guess, as pretty, Democrat, but definitely shifted towards socialism, as I began to see more and more of the problems with the way the United States works in particular. But then as I look at histories of other places, I think, socially, I'd say in some ways it's changed the groups of people that I prefer to be in. It's made it really hard to unlearn, so I guess once you learn the way the world actually works, once you start to see the corruption in politics and, you know, corporate greed and all these other things. It makes it really hard to hang out with people who defend the rights of corporations, like that should even exist. Or, it's produced a lot of conflict in those relationships, but I think it's also opened my eyes to the way that we can start to change people's ideas and educate around ending fear, which I think is the huge motivating factor behind people choosing corporations over people, or choosing political ideologies that hurt the most vulnerable. So yeah, I struggle with that. And then in other ways, I think it definitely impacted my career choice. So I think that for me, I want to be more involved with. I don't know what I'm going to do for the rest of my life, but I do know that where I'm headed, there's going to be some aspect of economic justice involved. So right now, I'm working largely around the real food and real communities movement in a very limited role because I'm a Vista, and so I think that gets in the way a lot of times. But I think it also has, okay. After rambling with lots of pauses, so there you go.
That's wonderful. Do you have critiques of the labor movement?
Yeah. So there's a very strong history of white men in the labor movement in the United States and then also in Europe. So I think that sometimes that legacy still kind of plays out. And so that, I guess, would be my biggest critique, is that we're not, as a movement, I don't think, a lot of times identities get in the way. Or rather, not identities get in the way, but people failing to recognize their own identity does get in the way. I guess I haven't really looked at the current climate of the labor movement outside of, SLAP or UAW 2322 in Amherst, Massachusetts. And so I think that, if we're looking at Walmart and the amazing things that are happening there, that's really positive. And so I think that it's moving in a good direction, slowly, as things tend to be. Yeah. So I don't really have too many because I don't think the big picture. Enough. Common. Okay. Cool.
So these next two questions have follow-ups based on whether you say yes or no. Do you see the labor movement as connected to larger issues of justice and progress?
Yes.
If yes, what other movements do you see it connected to? In what ways do you see these movements connected, and in what ways do you see them in tension or in conflict?
So a beautiful example of that is Ferguson's Black Friday protest. So around the issue of police brutality, particularly towards people of color, particularly young men of color. I think that and the conversations that are starting to happen around race, the Walmart protests at Walmart and other Black Friday retails kind of merged with that beautifully on Black Friday. And yeah, so there's one good example. As looking at the food movement, one of the ways that workers are starting to I think Immokalee is a beautiful example as well, of real food combining with worker justice. And so making sure that folks who, obviously the treatment of agricultural workers in the United States is horrifying. But I think starting to connect that with real food, so food that's produced in an economically just way, but also food that is, readily able to be consumed and not corn, or corn products, not necessarily corn. But I think that those intersections for me right now are the most relevant because of the work I'm doing, and then also because of the recent events in the United States that aren't really recent, that have been happening for years, but are now starting to reach the public domain. Yeah.
Cool. Second question, similar. Do you plan on staying involved in the labor movement?
Yes.
If yes, why and how so?
Okay. So, why? Why? Because you can't unlearn once you've learned. So, I think that would be the best answer for why. And then also because of the things that I've seen accomplished, that the real victories that workers have won, and the impacts that it has had on my life. So as an RA, that was, phenomenal impact. But then also on the lives of my peers and my peer mentors. So I think that, so that's why. And then how? I'm not sure how. I think this year I kind of stepped away from organizing in any capacity, just because I needed to get some space. But as I've been here, I've started to see I work in Browning, Montana, and the longer I'm here, the more I'm frustrated with the way the nonprofit sphere kind of works. Not so much that nonprofits aren't doing awesome things, because they are, and you can't deny that. But I think I'm very frustrated with the lack of progress, and I think that for me, the labor movement is a great way to make that progress happen faster. Even though it still is real slow, and takes a lot of sacrifice and a lot of work by some unbelievably courageous people. I think that the wins that are achieved through collective power are far more impressive and far more impactful than the work that I'm doing right now. So yeah, I don't know how I'm gonna be involved, but I know that it is going to happen once I can't be fired for it anymore.
So this pretty much wraps it up. Do you have any additional questions for me or anything else you would like to tell me or share?
I can't think of anything, but if you have follow-up questions, feel free to email me, or we can set this up again if that's easier.
All right. Thank you for talking with me.
Hi, my name is Jonah Grady. I am a student at the University of Massachusetts, studying social thought and political economy. The purpose of this interview is to collect the stories of women leaders in the labor movement and to compile them into an oral history project, including interview videos and written analysis. Many of these questions are intentionally broad. Please answer them to the best of your capabilities. You should feel free to interrupt and or ask clarifying questions about the interview questions if you have them. If you do not want to answer a question or part of a question due to the confidential, private, or triggering nature of that question for you, you can abstain from answering that or any question. Do I have your permission to record and share this interview?
Yes.
Are you comfortable with me taking notes during the interview?
Yes.
All right, let's get started. When and where did you grow up?
I grew up in Brockton, Massachusetts. I was born in 1991, and I lived there until I was 10. Then I moved to West Bridgewater, Massachusetts.
What type of political ideology were you raised with, either in general or with specific regard to labor?
Well, my parents were both postal workers and very involved with other workers. And for example, my mom she saves up her hours, her sick hours, and she shares them with people who are sick or have cancer, which is also being really sick. She shares about 40 hours every year with a man and a woman. So it was like a very nurturing kind of environment. I don't think I totally understood what labor and unions were when I was younger, but I understood that you work together, like with people, and try to help each other out. That was something that was important in growing up. A lot of my family members are working class, so there was a very strong understanding of how hard people work to make a living wage. And both of my parents worked like opposite shifts, night shift and day shift, so I also understood like how hard it was on a family to go through working to survive or working to like provide for a family.
So as postal workers, both your parents are union members or they're federal workers?
My dad is a union member. They're both union members. They're government workers, but they work within the postal union, from what I understand. Neither of them hold office in the union, but are a position in the union.
Did they ever talk about formal labor organizing, so the aspects of being in a labor union, a trade union?
They talked a lot about the ways their work would take away rights, or what has changed over the years, with kind of an attitude of this is the way it is sometimes, but with like a big understanding that they've come like a really far way within the postal world. But yeah, they talked a lot about the struggles at work, and how they like talked about it with other people there.
In what capacity are you currently involved in the labor movement?
Right now, I am a worker, but I am not organizing. I am working 3 part-time jobs in a restaurant, in theater, and through a university job in academia.
How did your background, upbringing, and experiences influence your decision to become involved in the labor movement?
So I've been working since I was 14, and I've worked probably like 16 jobs at this point. I've worked a lot of good jobs, but my positions in them were very transient. I was put in jobs, or I took on jobs that were kind of seasonal, or I knew that I would only be working them for a short amount of time. So I got little snapshots of what it was like to work in different places, but I have experienced a lot of really frustrating experiences through either coworkers or employers. I worked at an ice cream and turkey shop, and I was working with all women except for the one owner who was a man, and he was very strict about only having women work there because he didn't trust women and men to be together, and he was very very demanding of what happened there and controlling. And I mean, I understand he was a boss, but it was in a very unsafe way. It's very unstable, and there were times that he would fire people through the ice cream window who were there, like with their families. And he gave me a 2-week vacation, a 2-week leave, a 2-week firing for getting coverage. I got coverage for taking a day off to spend with someone whose grandmother had just died. And I ended up showing up for the shift anyways because they were threatening my job. But so it's like a pretty unsafe in a security of a job way. And I've worked for some like other pretty corrupt places where I was working in someone's basement, packaging military supplies, and really sketchy environment. I had no idea who this person was, and like just some weird jobs. So I've gone through some really frustrating stuff, and when I came to UMass, and I took a class called Grassroots Community Organizing, and it was a student facilitated space, and I learned a lot about organizing there, and through that class was given the opportunity to work with Unite Here in Springfield, Massachusetts. So I worked with them for a summer with restaurant workers in Springfield, and some restaurant workers in Worcester as well. So I spent the summer doing labor organizing, which was really, really amazing to do. And I felt like having worked so many years in different industries and in different jobs had given me a lens to think about labor, in addition to having taken that class in GCO.
You touched on some of this, but how and why did you join the labor movement?
I have seen so many people worked to the point of retirement, worked to the point of disability. Both my parents right now have been worked to the point of early retirement and disability, which has been really hard to see. My mom right now is finally retiring at 60, having experienced cancer twice, and is right now suffering with Lyme disease, and is working like 10-hour days, 6 days a week. And no one else works like she does in the post office, and there's no support for her, even though she's gone through such struggles. They don't give her any relief, and that's really hard to see. And my father also, 5 years ago, was worked to the point of hospitalization, and given overtime, he feels, for the purpose of pushing him out. And that ended up getting him really, really sick. So I've seen it very personally in my life. In that respect, the overworking of the labor force. And I think labor is the most important way right now to get to people, and to start uniting people. It's what drives us sick. It's what drives us mad. It's like what we identify ourselves around. When you ask someone what they do or like who they are, they usually say what they do for their living, and it's just so important to our society. It is a huge focus, and I think organizing through labor is a really smart way to get to people, and it hits on so many points of a person's life that they need support in, realizing like that they're not in it alone in their workplace, that they go to every single day, seeing their economic situation in a broader context, and like seeing it, not feeling so alone in all of the struggles that they feel economically. And yeah, it's massively economic. For me personally, I think a lot about the health risks involved with being overworked, and the workforce is massively like segregated racially, and this is a huge front that we can work on to be intentional about creating unity in that, and awareness, and bringing light to lots of injustice in this world and separation that we have. Men and women, the drastic differences in pay. We have so many opportunities to bring light to oppression and privilege in this world through the labor force. So for all those reasons, it just feels like such an important place to be organizing, and for me, it's why I think labor organizing is so important.
What do you consider to be the most important campaign you have been involved in within the labor movement? And important is fully up to your interpretation.
So I haven't had much experience in the labor movement, and to call upon my experience with Unite Here, I think it was really valuable for me to see the beginning of a union forming, and that was a lot of the work that I did that summer, and seeing all the struggles that come with that, and the trust that needs to be built, and the trust that just isn't there initially, and how hard that is, and like how hard bringing people together can be. So I think that working from the very beginning with a campaign was so valuable for me. It was really important. I think for me, I don't know how important it was in the grand scheme of organizing. I think it was really important, but not a monumental time of organizing. But it is right now a huge moment for fast food workers, and this was partially fast food, or at least people who would align themselves with fast food workers. So I think that was really important for me to see that, especially in the context of our like current environment.
How do you feel that your identity as a woman has impacted your motivations and experiences in the labor movement?
So I have definitely worked in places where I have been turned into a source of entertainment because of being a woman, working in a factory environment where I was the youngest female worker there. I got a lot of harassment and a lot of name calling. A lot of people would just come over and watch me work, even if I asked them not to. So that was a wake-up call to what young women probably experienced, starting in the factories, like or working in any male-dominated job. Really, it's horrible. So my experiences working with a lot of sexual harassment from my coworkers has been really important in thinking about my identity as a woman. It's also, there was one time that over the summer that I was working in the Unite Here, all of the female organizers got together and we talked about what were traditionally female strengths in organizing, and how they are often undervalued. Just the words used, like less assertive, more caring oriented, slower to get to the actions, like just so many things that are seen as negative but are really positive parts of a labor movement, because sometimes they move too fast and don't get people really involved or educated on what's happening. So it was really powerful to be in that room of women and talking about how we saw our strengths, what obstacles we experienced, and I think that creating spaces like that are so important for women to feel strong in the labor movement. Because action is so important, and the media isn't going to show those quiet evenings that women are sitting around and talking about this kind of stuff. So I think that space is so vital for creating a whole labor movement. And yeah, it was, in my experience of organizing, I've definitely taken on very empathetic roles, and doing one-on-ones with people and really pushing them to get a little deeper into why they're involved in what they're doing and getting them to open up and talk about what they were really afraid of in doing organizing work has been something that I focused a lot on when I was organizing. And it was something that I also was really aware of and wanted to learn more in different tactics to organizing. But it's hard in a 3-month span to get someone to recognize my strengths and help push me towards gaining more skills. So I think when I do return to organizing, working on strengths that aren't traditionally females' role is going to be really, really important for me.
How do you feel that other aspects of your identity have impacted your motivations and experiences in the labor movement?
So coming from a working class background has definitely motivated my involvement and empathy for people, and deep understanding of where people come from and recognizing people's strengths beyond academic knowledge or being able to articulate things in a very perfect, concise way. And I understand and am patient with people who don't have the correct words or the right words to talk about the movement. That's always something that I've been really patient and aware of, and validating of. And my identity as a white person, especially in my experience working in Springfield, was it was really important for me definitely not for them. We were working with predominantly black men, some black women, and it was the interns that worked there were all white academic people. So it was really frustrating. There were times that I just didn't want to be there. And there was a time that I stepped out of the room. And I remember one of my good friends and coworkers saying, you know what, like, deal with your like white guilt because you stepped out of the room and that doesn't help anyone. So that was really important for me to have someone call me out on that, and also to be in a space where that happened. I don't think it was good for other people to have to deal with all of us white young academic kids trying to tell them what to do. I think that that's a huge problem right now in the labor movement, but I think for me it was a huge growing point. And being a English speaker only has been super detrimental to organizing, especially in Worcester, where there was a huge Lebanese community and a huge Spanish community. There were times that I was in one-on-ones with Spanish-speaking families, and it was beautiful in a way, the way that they wanted to cater to me and try to explain what they were talking about with my other coworker. But it was also really frustrating to have to put them in that situation where they had to double explain themselves when it's like they probably have to do that all the time. So I definitely know I need to learn some languages if I want to be useful and helpful and not make people cater to me in the labor movement.
How has your involvement with the labor movement influenced you in terms of personal beliefs, political ideology, social connections, and or other elements of your life?
Social connections, I definitely got in with a crowd of organizers, which was in those female organizers, and that was really life-changing for me. So it made me realize how important community is in doing work, especially straight out of college, having like a student community that was like very understood. Stepping out of college and not having a understood community that I was part of was a thing that happened. And yeah, going into organizing with a focus, they had a focus on creating these kinds of spaces for community was definitely has definitely opened my eyes to like wanting to create more intentional spaces around struggles with work and validating why we do what we do. So that's one way that it helped the social connection aspect. Political ideologies, I'm really struggling with national movements, national organizing. It doesn't feel grassroots, so I'm really trying and have been grappling with it since working with Unite Here, how best to create a movement for people. Do we make the decisions and then tell them what to do, or nurture them into making these decisions that we've already made for them? So I think recognizing the manipulation in a national labor movement has been really confusing. It's been really confusing. to figure out what way to do it best. And I think that comes with more research and talking to more organizers and different who do it differently, because people do it in so many different ways, and that's why it's a big movement. If we were all doing it the same way, it'd be kind of impossible. So grappling with the best way is, at least for me or a community that I'm involved with, to organize. So I guess it hasn't really I haven't come to any understanding, just more questions and curiosity, confusion.
Do you have critiques of the labor movement?
Yes, I do. It definitely ties into the last question. One of the biggest critiques of the labor movement one of my biggest critiques is that we drive people to do things and there's a plan, and we create space for things to happen, but we want things to happen. We have an intention, we have a goal, and it doesn't feel grassroots. There are probably really amazing organizers and organizations that are doing it in a really grassroots way, but it feels very manipulative, using my story of self or my story of why I do what I do, to get someone else to open up, to get someone to do something that I need them to do, to find their story and use that almost against them, but use that to manipulate them, was so frustrating. It's something I'm pretty good at, getting people to share their stories, so having that highlighted as my strength in this movement was made me feel kind of sick, to be part of something that feels so manipulative, pink slipping. So I think figuring out how to make that more genuine, less manipulative, less part of a intern's job, and more someone who's going to be there in a sustainable way. Yeah, that's a big critique for me. Yeah, I think it would be hard for me to critique in a big way the labor movement. That's one of mine.
Can you explain pink slipping?
Pink slipping, from what I understand, it's kind of documenting people's stories and what fires them up, what gets them to want to fight. So, for example, if someone has 3 kids and their husband is disabled and they are being harassed at work by their manager, having all those points down to be able to go back and dig in and get them to do something, because you're getting them all fired up about their experiences, their life struggles, their need for a better economic situation, a need for a safer work environment, and using that towards a goal is what I understand pink slipping to be.
Do you see the labor movement as connected to larger issues of justice and progress? If yes, what other movements do you see it connected to? And in what ways do you see these movements connected? And in what ways do you see them in tension or conflict? And if no, why not?
Okay, so I definitely do see them, the labor movement, as connected to other larger and smaller movements. I see it connected to the LGBTQIA movement. I know that when I worked with Unite Here, we went to an LGBTQ rally in New York and worked with people there to sign petitions, and that was just like in a small way, but fighting for rights at work is directly related to like fighting for people's like human rights. So I think also, I mean, Black Lives Matter, like, I think that we'll see like a lot of like solidarity happening through restaurant workers and folks who are involved with Black Lives Matter. Like, I think that that's something that'll come up. I'm positive, but don't totally know the connections, but I'm sure that a lot of organizing groups went to Ferguson when that was happening. And I think that it's kind of a beautiful thing with organizing is understanding how one another's struggles are connected to each other. And I think that that's something that has happened throughout the history of organizing, is that it's all really connected. Sometimes it'll take a long time to figure out why connected, but I think that they all really at some point intersect and can help each other out in different ways. Whether it's financially, whether it's numbers. Yeah. So I don't really have like a solid understanding of how they're all connected, but I know that they are.
Do you plan on staying involved in the labor movement? If yes, why and in what capacities? And if no, why not, and what do you plan to pursue instead?
So for me, I want to take some time to work and not work in the labor movement. And for the upcoming few years, I'd really like to pursue something within community education and working towards creating active citizens through education work. I train students at the university right now in a really like engaged form of education that seeks to produce active citizens, and it's something that I want to pursue in the future and pull that into the work that I do forever, and bringing in elements of labor organizing and sharing my stories and sharing my struggles and getting people to share their struggles and stories too, towards educating one another and eventually action. But I think my focus will be really primarily on education and getting people the tools and skills and story sharing that they need to be able to work towards justice. And in the future, if I end up in a job, which I've definitely ended up in before, where the place needs to be organized and my coworkers are down for it, like, that's where I'll be. Like, that's the kind of organizing that I want to do. When it's like really my community. So I think until I settle down and like get into a community, it'll be a while. But until then, I'll be doing other work.
Do you have any additional questions for me or anything else you'd like to tell me or share?
No.
All right. Thank you for talking with me.
Yes. Thanks for having me.
Hi, my name is Jenna Grady. I am a student at the University of Massachusetts studying social thought and political economy. The purpose of this interview is to collect the stories of women leaders in the labor movement and to compile them into an oral history project, including interview videos and written analysis. Many of the questions are intentionally broad. Please answer them to the best of your capabilities. You should feel free to interrupt and or ask clarifying questions about the interview questions. If you don't want to answer a question or part of a question due to the confidential, private, or triggering nature of that question for you, you can abstain from answering that or any question. Do I have your permission to record and share this interview?
Yes, you do.
Are you comfortable with me taking notes during the interview?
Totally. Totally fine.
Right. When and where were you born?
I was born in Landstuhl, Germany on October 18th, 1991.
And where did you grow up?
I grew up all over Europe. My mom worked for the Department of Defense as a child psychologist, so I lived in Germany, then we moved to Italy, then we moved to Belgium, and then we moved back to Italy. So I spent most of my life in Naples, Italy. That's the largest portion.
What type of political ideology were you raised with, either in general or with specific regard to labor?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So my mom is kind of like, or was at least when I was growing up, kind of a middle of the road Democrat, wanted good things for people, but definitely did not, identify as an activist, and kind of went along with the status quo of things. I remember growing up being kind of imbued with a Catholic ideology of, the meek shall inherit the earth, and, poor people deserve, respect or love or compassion, that kind of social justice Catholic kind of outlook on things. But it's not really politicized. It's just like, very empathetic way of reacting or experiencing or feeling poverty. So I think that kind of sums up my mom when I was growing up. She's actually more political now. My father definitely has like a social bent to him. He grew up in Germany. Apparently in my parents, or my dad's side of the family's past, there's been a labor organizer too, lots of socialist members, or socialist party members. So there's definitely like a more labor, anti-capitalistic focus from my German side. It also makes more sense because Germany tends to be much more left on those issues as a nation. So I remember getting pretty strong like left thoughts from my father, whether it be like anti-corporate greed or like, certain people in the world, certain elites are powerful and they also make bad decisions for the environment and for people. But definitely not an activist. Definitely like talks. He's a good, dinner table socialist, but definitely we never went to the streets. We never really participated in political protests of any kind. Thoroughly anti-war. That's the first issue I got really politicized about when I was a kid. I never went to the streets, and I think part of it's because, especially when we were really connected to the U.S. military bases, you don't, at least when my life was very much on a military base, there's really no space for political activism. You can't do anything political. You can't even have a I'm a Democrat sticker on. There's no political organization. So I think that may be part of the reason why I wasn't an activist growing up.
Could you speak a little bit more to what it means to be anti-war on a military base or in a military family?
Yeah, that was really funny. So my dad has always been super anti-war. I mean, part of it's because his whole, his parents' generation, they were all in the war. My grandfather was forced into service, with the Nazis, even though he was a socialist and didn't want to go to war. So yeah, I just kind of grew up with this concept of war is the worst thing ever. No people really benefit from war. People just die, and certain people that are powerful kind of reap the benefits. And so yeah, that was kind of interesting, political ideology to have while being on a military base, especially since I started at U.S. school when we were bombing Baghdad, and we had to stand up in our class and put our hands over our hearts and watch the bombing of Baghdad, and I couldn't do it. So I think there was definitely some disconnect there, and my mom would still this day sadly will sometimes kind of make the point, well, the U.S. military doesn't just do bad things, there's some good that they do, they do some humanitarian efforts, and my dad and I kind of retort, well, yeah, maybe 1 to 2% of their budget, if that. My dad would probably say none. So there's definitely a little bit of that disconnect or kind of tension with the people I was around on a military base, and I definitely got some heated political arguments with kids whose parents are fighting in Iraq, and here I am saying forget war altogether. This doesn't do anyone any good. But I think most middle school and high school experiences, other things kind of come to the fore more, so that's a smaller part of my school experience. Yeah.
In what capacity are you currently involved with the labor movement?
Currently, I'm the mobilization coordinator for the graduate student union at UMass, so the graduate students who are TAs and research assistants, etc., all work under a UAW contract. And so we have our union, the Graduate Employee Organization, GEO, and I'm currently the mobilization coordinator for that union, as well as I sit on the bargaining committee because we're in the process of bargaining a new contract. And I also study labor studies. I'm a master's student in the labor studies program at UMass Amherst.
How did your background, upbringing, and experiences influence your decision to become involved in the labor movement?
I definitely kind of fell into it, even though I had like my dad's lefty, rhetoric or politics. Have always like been part of me. I definitely didn't know much about organizing or organized labor until college. I got involved in the social justice community, and through that I found my home in labor, kind of oddly, but that's kind of like where I fell, where I felt things were moving, and it kind of fit with my politics of, because I already had like great left politics, that, the whole collective of people should be living better and be less oppressed, and corporations should be getting away with what they get away with, and employers in general, which translated to employers in general. So it's kind of like I was like kind of facilitated into the labor space by certain mentors that I had, and just because they were kind of like campaigns moving around those issues when I was getting involved in activism. Wisconsin was happening during that time. Some workers on our campus were organizing. So it's just, I think there's like certain people and certain moments that kind of help move me into the labor space versus like a feminist space or a different activist space on campus. That's my best bet. I've kind of noticed more of the connections to my family and where I grew up like later. Like I remember like a few months after I started being a labor activist, realizing, oh my god, anti-war is like a labor issue. Like, those like things kind of like connected like a little bit later on. Yeah.
How and why did you join the labor movement?
I think there's a few reasons why I joined the labor movement. A, I think that no person is worth more than another person, and so it's ridiculous that there's a class of elites that have been screwing over the masses for most of history, and how that's been accelerated under capitalism. So I think just, as a person that has feelings, and like as a person who, believes in justice, I think labor issues kind of affects almost all of humanity, and that's a good way to move through social change. And I think also like the material conditions of people's lives are just, incredibly important. Like people need to be able to eat and sleep and feel safe, and your economic position in life like affects that greatly. And for me personally, like I want to be able to do social justice work growing up or as I get older, that is like well paid. Like I don't want to volunteer at like a survival center for 40 years and like not get paid, or only get paid like $8 an hour and have no benefits. Like I want to be able to do social justice work that's important for people while like having a decent paycheck and like health benefits. And I don't think that's greedy. I think that if you're looking to improve everyone's life, you belong within that you deserve to have a decent life as well. And if you want to have a family or something, that your job can support that. I think there's often this kind of thing like, oh, if you want to work for people, if you want to, push forward social justice initiatives, you just have to be a martyr, like sacrifice yourself for the movement. And I'm not saying that certain sacrifices aren't made or shouldn't be made, or that certain moments of martyrdom like are effective, but it does make sense for a whole like group of people, whole generation of activists to say, oh fuck it, like we're gonna just throw our our own lives and our own well-being under the bus, because the point of activism is to make a better life for everyone in a world that you want to live in. And so if you cannot at least replicate part of that world in the work that you're doing, whether it's for me in a union or in another space, it just doesn't kind of make sense to me. So some people call it prefigurative politics, but I think it makes sense to incorporate some of the things that you're passionate about, the way you want the life and the vision of the world as it should be, and the current work that you're doing. And I see unions as a space to do that.
What do you consider to be the most important campaign you've been involved in within the labor movement, and important is up to your interpretation?
I think the way I define importance, like at least for me at this point in my life, is when I saw like immediate, tangible results that, yeah, I think that's how I would define important. And so for me, it was the peer mentor campaign back in 2011 to 2012, where a group of resident assistant undergraduate students were fired for no reason at UMass Amherst, and they just received an email saying, hey, nice work supporting the residents, but we've deemed your position, kind of useless, so we're eliminating your position. You don't have your job next month. Good luck. And I thought that was a grave injustice, A, because you're firing people for no reason, and people deserve to have jobs, and student debt is through the roof, and these people often support first-year college students, people that have a hard time transitioning to school and to corporate higher ed. So I thought, just kind of a gut reaction was like, these people need to keep their jobs. And so organizing around that, and after months and months of creative organizing, really cool protests and community building, being able to get those jobs back was an incredibly important experience for me, and so it was one of the most meaningful, probably the most meaningful time period of my life. Especially because it was just me and some other, activists that said, hey, we're going to take on this campaign. We've never done anything like this before. We've never organized people in this manner. We've never been able to, defeat, a administrative decree of, this is not how it's going to be, and to, rise up against that was so empowering. To realize that we, silly little undergrads, beeping, booping about campus, could bring people's jobs back, was incredibly powerful. To realize that you don't have to just take what the powers that be give you, that you can revert decisions or create your own initiatives and make those policy, is incredibly empowering, especially when it's your first time doing it. So that for me was most important. And it was a labor issue, and that definitely cemented me into the labor movement, that moment.
How do you feel that your identity as a woman has impacted your motivations and experiences in the labor movement?
That's a really good question. I mean, on a big picture level, women are screwed over more than men in any economic issue. Whether it's how much you make, or, if a female-bodied person, a male-bodied person, sire a child, who takes on the burdens of that, what people get fired because they decide to become a mother. I think on a big picture, women fighting for women in the labor movement is a really important struggle, especially since women tend to be in positions in jobs that are lower paid. Any workforce that women enter into, wages drop. So, on that level, I think, labor is a women's issue, and women's issues are labor issues in most cases. So, being a woman, I obviously acknowledge that, and that's part of the reason why I am involved in the fights I'm involved in. And I think, personally, I know a lot of women have had trouble within the labor movement. There's definitely still a white male presence within unions that can be problematic. I've been really lucky. I have not really experienced that much sexism or misogyny. Yes, people definitely didn't take me very seriously in meetings some years back, and even now, sometimes when I go to new labor spaces, I definitely feel like I have to kind of prove myself, and I think that's obviously gender, but also my age. That's part of that. And I do remember, when I first became co-chair of the RA union, the resident assistants at UMass are unionized, that, administrators would not forward me important, documents that were part of bargaining, but they forwarded to my male co-chair, or that the union rep, one of my union reps at the time, didn't respond to, my emails, wouldn't, do what I asked them to do, which was, really simple things, set up a training for resident assistants, and it took him 3 months to, schedule that training, even though I had written up the email for him and he already had all the materials. So, there's definitely, some experiences of sexism that, that I've had being active in labor, but in contrast to many of my female peers, it hasn't tinted my experience as much, and I've avoided a lot of it. And I think part of it is because I'm in a much more radical labor space. And right now that's very female body dominant. So it doesn't really factor particularly. I don't really notice it in my day-to-day life within my labor spaces. But I do think that's kind of rare. I would like to note that.
How do you feel that other aspects of your identity have impacted your motivations and experiences in the labor movement?
I think being a white person in labor can be kind of interesting. I think within the progressive spaces of labor, it's, most people are on the right page, on the right side of history, and know how to stand up in solidarity with Ferguson and how not to, and how to navigate those issues and how to fight for people of color within unions. So yeah, I think within the progressive place, from a white standpoint, it seems like while being white, definitely me being white definitely affects how I engage in that discourse. I think it's dealt with pretty well, but I do notice kind of in general there is this perception that white union members are not particularly progressive on race issues, and so sometimes I think people kind of assume that I'm this mainstream labor lady that doesn't really get those issues or doesn't get where my place is. So I think that's an effect, and also I just think it's I do occupy a privileged position in some ways, even within the labor hierarchy, but also I'm a master's student, I'm white, I come from a middle class background. I think those layers I notice how I'm kind of privileged in that sense, even within the labor movement. And while the labor movement does try to raise the bar for everyone, there's obviously moments where we don't do that as well. And so there is definitely some classism within the labor movement and some racism that still needs to be addressed. And me trying to figure out where I fit within that with my identities is kind of interesting. Again, it's not something I have to think about right now in the current space I'm in, because I'm advocating for fellow grad students, etc. But I think it's definitely a bigger issue that I'll have to figure out my place later on. I think I notice my identity is more when I'm learning about the labor movement's past and just how messed up it is on all fronts. There's a pretty significant conservative history of the labor movement that was involved in imperialism, that was racist, that was sexist, classist. So kind of and when I was learning about that in more detail, I was like, oh my god, why am I part of this movement? This is the worst. Oh my god, maybe I should drop out or whatever. But then I kind of had a come to Jesus meeting with myself, and realized, this is the bedrock of my program, my labor studies program. People are trying to address these ills, and I've been doing organizing and doing labor stuff really differently in the last 3 to 4 decades, and I want to be part of that. I want to make it better. Everything is messed up, almost any organization you get involved in, any group of people, there's problems. Any history of any organization has problems. Look at the feminist movement, not exactly a darling picture in terms of their history. So I decided that it didn't make sense for me to drop out, but I just needed to be better and work within that history and make it better, fight with the people to make it better. It's kind of where I plan.
How has your involvement with the labor movement influenced you in terms of political beliefs or political ideology, personal beliefs, social connections, or other elements of your life?
It's kind of hard to tell if it's the labor element or just the radical elements of my life. I've definitely been moved further left in the last 4 years, 5 years that how long I've been active. So that's, and I guess labor does have a pretty big impact on that, because it's one of the great things about labor is that there's this history of doing protest, direct action, that doesn't always exist in other spaces. So that's an overtly like confrontational role against the employer, against corporations. So having that tradition definitely moved me to be much more like, okay, direct actions are necessary, protests are necessary, this is what we have to do, and so it's more confrontational. And I don't think by nature I'm a very confrontational person, especially coming from my class background. I really felt the need to, sit on someone's doorstep and act a protest, or, that's not, I don't think, I grew up in a household where it's like, oh, you're gonna become a lawyer, or like a bureaucratic entity that, wields their magic progressive sword and, makes things better, or wand probably. I think my parents are anti-swords. It's like, I think it's helped me be more like grassroots, direct action, confrontational, and I do thank labor for that. I also think labor's made me more practical in a lot of ways, like learning in the bargaining process how to realize that this is as much as you're going to get in this contract cycle, this is the best you can bargain for, and learn how to make, how to negotiate, like have to, what's the word? Like bargain for, something in the middle that's better than you currently have, but not ideal. Where usually I think, especially in the radical social justice world that I come from, it's like you stick with your vision, and like you have to get the vision. And of course the vision is important, and of course it'd be completely regressive if we didn't work towards that vision, but sometimes you have to accept a certain amount of improvement right now, and then come back and fight for more later. And that little practicality is something I'm still figuring out and still learning and developing. It's definitely not something that comes naturally to me, but something that labor is teaching me. Which kind of seems counterintuitive to radical politics, but I think it's kind of necessary, because or else you get stuck in your radical vision and you just start shouting marks at each other, and that's like all well and good, but it's not going to get higher wages or better healthcare benefits, or gender inclusive bathrooms to the people on this campus, or better healthcare for OBGYN. And so it's like, it doesn't help even like the anti-capitalist mission necessarily, and it definitely doesn't help you get all your social justice demands. So I think that's something I'm kind of like learning right now.
You touched on some of this earlier, but do you have critiques of the labor movement?
Yeah, I have critiques of the labor movement. I think it's just so hard. Oh my god. Where to start? So yes, labor needs to be recruiting and encouraging and developing leaders that are much more female and non-white, not cis, not visibly cisgendered, or have different sexualities and way of expressing themselves. So from a social justice, like identity politics standpoint, a lot more needs to be done. And I think on a more labor critique of labor, there are, top union officials that kind of belong to the, bourgeoisie class. Labor, as it's organized in the United States, has kind of like replicated the corporate structure. And so people higher up on that corporate ladder, or at least on the labor ladder or labor side of things, they, in some ways, have similar interests as capitalists. And so I think there's a lot of reform that needs to happen on that front. I do think that within the labor movement, there's sometimes a little too much hierarchy, and that some of the class interests that they're supposed to be defending sometimes get muddled, especially higher up in the ranks. And there's also, of course, cases of union officials, signing contracts with management behind union members' backs. I mean, there's definitely like some pretty bad stuff that's happened. And so I think figuring out ways of accountability for hired union officials is important. But then that gets into a really tough debate where I don't really know how to weigh in on what's the most efficient way to advocate for the working classes within the union structure. Like, how hierarchical should it be? is grassroots always the best? And like in a lot of ways, unions are organizations that need to stay alive, and until we have a big new labor movement where everything gets tossed up, I think we'll be making significant gains, but it's not a social movement moment right now for labor. And so I think in a way, unions are organizations and they have to operate like organizations that are bureaucratic and not always revolutionary. But I also hate saying that because I want unions to be much more revolutionary than they are. So I think it kind of comes down to every union moving towards a more left place in the way they organize and the way that they structure and finance things. But I also don't see it happening. Yeah, I think there's certain steps that the unions can take. Hire more diverse people, take more left-like structure, redistribute paychecks a little bit, especially in unions where the higher-ups make 5-6 times what their members make. Like, that needs to change. But I've become a little more cautious. Maybe I've become more conservative, where I don't think changing all labor unions to like completely horizontal structures is the most efficient thing, because for institutional memory and for legal knowledge and stuff being passed down, some structures and hierarchy probably has to remain. But I hate saying that.
So the next two questions are two-parters based on your response to the first question. So do you see the labor movement as connected to larger issues of justice and progress?
Definitely.
So what other movements do you see it connected to, and in what ways do you see these movements connected, and in what ways do you see them in tension or conflict?
So one that's really in the forefront of my mind right now is labor's connection to the environmental movement, and it's one that's necessary. It's actually a good follow-up from the last question, because that's something that all unions need to change their status on. Like, I don't care if your union members are currently, working the tar sands pipeline and Keystone XL pipeline to get tar sands oil. I understand the desire to protect your current members, but you have to transition to another energy source. That's just unacceptable, and especially since if we move to more alternative and green energies, there'd be so many more jobs. I don't really get the labor critique of the environmental movement, because it's the labor's response to the environmental movement saying, oh, we need greener energy and greener jobs, and labor sometimes will say, oh no, we can't do that, they'll destroy our members' jobs. Yeah, but the environment's destroying your members' life, your health, your members' health and their family's health. So I kind of feel like labor needs to take a much stronger stance in solidarity with the environmental movement to help create greener, alternative, better jobs that will sustain not only, members of that community, but also could help transition us from a less exploitative economic system. So that's something labor needs to be much stronger on, for the sake of their members, but also the sake for the plan as a whole. On other issues, I think on racial justice, labor needs to take a much firmer stance, because people of color are the most exploited economically across the globe. In the U.S., whether it's in the prison system, where you have people doing work that would be done outside of the system, outside of prison. Perhaps a union job is being done by people virtually unpaid within the prison system, or people of color, or to undocumented folks that work within the United States are also people of color. All of these, in labor, we're always talking about we need higher wages, better ways of life, but what's pushing everything down is people of color having to work for very low wages or no wages at all in forms of slavery. So, from that perspective, labor has to be much more intentional organizing people of color and organizing with people of color for a better place in life, and also against criminalization of people of color, because when people of color are thrown into the prison system, not only is it awful for like the lives of people of color in their communities, but also extends into creating corporate profits and drags everyone else down, wages-wise. So that's just completely messed up and needs to be addressed. So yeah, intentionally organizing people of color with people of color and protecting people of color from injustices of our injustice system, in quotes, is key for the labor movement going forward. I have less to say on the gender side of things. I think it's just much more representational, and that when women in unions climb the ladder, climb the social ladder within unions, or climb to a higher paid job or a more leadership position, that they don't get shut down, harassed, things like that. I think that's within unions something they have to figure out, and be much more willing to recruit women and members of the LGBTQIA community. Those two groups, I think it's more of a representational thing, and then with that, making sure that those issues get advocated for. But I also know less about gender and LGBTQIA issues, so I may not know the connection to the bigger picture connection to labor issues as I kind of do with race or within other labor issues. Or with other labor issues. Excuse me, long week.
Do you plan on staying involved in the labor movement?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I don't really see myself being able to do social justice work in a decent job position without working for the labor movement. It's the only place I know where they'll pay for your health care and that you can have paid days off and leave and vacation time and parental leave and good pay and benefits, pensions. I will probably never have a pension if I don't work for the labor movement. I just don't see a sustainable way for me to do this work in the long term unless I work for labor, and I want to work for labor anyways. So win-win.
Yeah. In what capacities do you plan on staying involved?
That's a really good question. I like the education work within labor. That might be a very gendered answer to give. I like, organizing. I know most positions in labor I find interesting, and the great thing about unions is there's so many different positions within unions that you can move around from doing representing and servicing members to bargaining committee work to research to education work to being a communications person to lobbying. You could move around and do lots of different interesting work within the same kind of framework. Right now, lobbying is the last thing I'd want to do. Law is also not something I'd be really stoked about doing right now, but I may end up more in that field. But right now, organizing, education work, kind of just general lower tiered work for labor is probably what I'm most interested in.
Great. That wraps up my formal questions. Do you have any additional questions for me or anything else you would like to tell me or share?
Organized labor is really important. Everyone should get involved because everyone works for a living, or at least virtually everyone in the world works for a living or in some capacity. I think the labor movement has been siphoned off into its own interest group, which is partially organized labor's fault, but I highly encourage other people to think about their position economically and be involved in labor fights, because the point of the labor movement is to rise all boats to take us all to a better place materially. Thanks for interviewing me, Jenna.
Thank you for talking with me.
No problem.
Great.
Now there once was a union maid. She never was afraid of the goons and the ginks and the company finks and the deputy sheriff who made the raid. And she went to the union hall where a meeting act was called. And when the boys come up to her, Lord, this is what you do. Oh, you can't scare me. I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union. Oh, you can't scare me. I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union.